Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
His father was one of the more than 50 patients treated here at the Allen Memorial Institute under a secret program designed to develop brainwashing techniques. The CIA was behind it. Documents pried loose in 1979 showed that through a front organization, the Central Intelligence Agency funded what was called the MK Project.
And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole News and Public Affairs operation in 1954, the ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories.
Another gruesome video. The Japanese government says it appears to show his beheading at the hands of ISIS.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Operation Mockingbird is a CIA program that was developed specifically to interface with the media apparatus, the news services, to affect what we believe to be real in our society and in our culture and ultimately our civilization. And it did so by making contact with reporters, conscripting them into some form of the agenda, either by paying them money or enticing them through various means like parties, drugs, things like this. And then once they could be controlled to a certain extent, by whatever means necessary, sometimes even blackmail and intimidation, then they would use these reporters, they would turn them into CIA assets, and then disseminate information that was carefully tailored to sculpt and manipulate human consciousness.
It was about recruiting journalists in the US as well as abroad. It was about getting involved with different student groups and essentially trying to influence the flow of different media organizations, even elements of Hollywood. And this was a program that was started back in the 1950s. A lot of it came out in congressional hearings, which you can still watch to this day. There's a lot of it that got completely classified and was never revealed to the public. The CIA will say to this day that it no longer exists, that this was just a one-time program or one-time project. But I personally believe, and many other researchers believe, that whether they still call it Mockingbird or not, that intelligence agencies, both in America and also around the world, have engaged in infiltration of the mainstream media for quite some time, and that still continues right up to the present day.
Well, one of the four principal functions of the CIA is to gather intelligence and ideally forward it to the president, the users of information, the policymakers, as they say. There are other functions, however, some of them more legitimate than others. One is to run secret wars, the covert action that's written and talked about so much, like what's happening in Nicaragua today from Honduras. Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories.
Did you buy his confidence with true stories?
You buy his confidence and set him up. We've seen this happen recently with Jack Anderson, for example, who has his intelligence sources, and he has also admitted that he's been set up by them. Every fifth story just simply being false.
The essence of Operation Mockingbird is revealed in its name. What happens is they infiltrate media companies specifically for the purpose, as we had said before, to create the perception of mass consensus on a certain issue. So what is a mockingbird? A mockingbird is a signal repeating animal. You speak something to a mockingbird, it regurgitates that same point. So what the CIA has essentially done, and it's in the name of the program, is it has installed mockingbirds in media company after media company after media company. Arguably, it funded and started a good number of these media companies.
Governments and alphabet soup agencies like to use euphemisms. For instance, they'll often stick the word operation or project in front of one of these experiments, and that's exactly what they are. They're experiments conducted on unsuspecting human beings for the purposes of gathering psychological or emotional information to create a profile on the average person to understand better their susceptibilities and what drives them, for purposes of control and manipulation.
So Operation Mockingbird was a crystallization of basically a Nazi infiltration of America's mainstream media system.
Any of the secret societies or even the intelligence communities, right, have long ago been infiltrated by socialists. Now, we might say that we might agree that we have heard of, Paperclip, Operation Paperclip, and we think we're dealing with Nazi infiltration, the rat line. They're socialists, right? You've had your Pavlovians, for goodness sake, right? And you've had your behaviorists right in situ in the United States of America.
This was something that had been under development for a long time before that, And my understanding was that this was really a push to crystallize that power, to reinforce that power structure.
I mean, another recent example could be the Clinton list that came out through WikiLeaks, where, you know, dozens and dozens, over 100, I think, journalists were exposed as having basically let the puppets work them like the Clintons work them like a puppet and give them specific things to write about, approve articles, give them specific questions to ask. And they were fine with it. You know, they were happy to sell out to be given access. And that's the lowest level. The highest level, go back to the CIA, Operation Mockingbird. That's where the deep state actively, the cabal or CIA or whatever you want to call it, actively infiltrates fake news and guides from the highest levels. And it's the biggest threat, I think, to our republic ever. And I think that's what we're seeing now from the biggest lie ever told by fake news, which is coronavirus. You're seeing the power of hidden hands in our media.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Millions of Americans staying at home are relying on Amazon.
Amazon has transformed its operations in response to COVID-19 to protect employees and keep packages flowing.
Amazon has transformed its operations in response to COVID-19 to protect employees and keep packages flowing.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy while still delivering those packages to your doorstep.
The company is keeping employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy. The company is keeping its employees safe and healthy.
It spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
It has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
It has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
It has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
Amazon says it has spent $800 million on increased wages and overtime pay during the pandemic.
One of the agendas of Mockingbird was to carefully sculpt certain news narratives and tailor and get ahead of information that was being pushed to the public. So if a news story came out about an event, they would use this aspect of the propaganda mechanism to ensure that whatever narrative was pushed to the public would fit the narrative that was designed by these higher aspects of the deep state.
What seems to be the way is that there are people who are seeking positions of power in this world, and they fit a specific psychological profile. So one of the best points of evidence I've seen for this is the Satanic Church and the Luciferian Church and the way they actually recruit people. If you look at some of the processes that they've created for that, it really is a process of psychologically profiling people. So as I understand it, because there is an occult influence, a sort of satanic and Luciferian influence that really runs through a lot of these groups of power, they'll have something like the Satanic Church, which is very public and very open, and they actually use that to create a psychological profile system. And so there's sort of layers of screening that occurs so that someone may come into that church and they reveal aspects of that psychological profile that seem beneficial to a group that's in power, like an Illuminati type group or a group like that. And then there's tests that are put in place to see if these people will go further and further. And that's based on, basically how much they will compromise values and morals to obtain more and more power. So my understanding is that there's initial screening processes and then deeper and deeper challenges that bring people to the level that they eventually end up at.
One of the ways they would get in contact with or broker these relations with these news agencies and reporters is either by conscripting them, by surrounding them with certain luminaries who would then incept or cultivate ideas within these people. This happened a lot during the 60s.
Some of it was, actual deep state players getting positions of power in the media, but then some of it was also just gaining assets and corrupting, journalists who maybe didn't understand they were being corrupted.
One of the other ways that they helped make contact with reporters and infiltrate these organizations was to use bribery or blackmail.
Maybe it was journalists who thought they were being brought into something greater, that they were being asked to participate in the preservation of national security. So when you get into how they infiltrated it, I know there's a wide variety of tactics that were utilized.
You also work on their human vulnerabilities to recruit them in a classic sense, to make them your agent so that you can control what they do, so you don't have to set them up sort of, you know, by putting one over on them. So you can say, here, plant this one next Tuesday.
Can you do this with responsible reporters?
Yes, the Church Committee brought it out in 1975, and then Woodward and Bernstein put an article in Rolling Stone a couple of years later. 400 journalists cooperating with the CIA, including some of the biggest names in the business, to consciously introduce the stories into the press.
So if they had a journalistic asset that they wanted to obtain, well, it was about creating a psychological profile and really figuring out a way to get that person on board. So if that was an appeal to their own sense of pride and patriotism, then that would have been how it was applied to them. Whereas someone else who had a stronger moral code or a stronger set of values, then for them it might have been more about extortion or bribery or blackmail. So they really employed a whole variety of tactics to make sure that they had the assets they needed. And then from there, it really worked in tandem with America being hypnotized by production value and having that nightly news anchor speak the truth, with all the beautiful graphics. This was very psychologically impactful for people. Now, you look, it's come back around and you have alternative media finally challenging that, but that's only happened now as independent journalists and alternative media sources have started to approach the production levels that Operation Mockingbird had the advantage of utilizing from its beginnings.
Once they had control over an individual or organization, they could then use that control to disseminate propaganda at various levels. At the local level, they would create what we might call like a local community level of fake news media. So what do the people interact with at the water cooler, while they're at work, while they're at the dinner table? That comes from the local media to a certain extent. Then at the national media level, you deal with global mass media, mass cultural issues. And then at the, what we might even call quasi-spiritual or cosmic level, we deal with Hollywood. So how the ideas about the ultimate nature of reality and the fundamental nature of existence and what we're supposed to do here as beings, how do those ideas get manipulated? It's through media and fiction and television shows and things like this.
Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz. I said come back tomorrow.
If you are really great and powerful, you'll keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the great Oz? You ungrateful creatures think yourselves lucky that I'm giving you audience tomorrow instead of 20 years from now. Oh, the great Oz has spoken. Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The great Oz has spoken.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
You are? I don't believe you.
No, I'm afraid it's true. There's no other wizard except me. You humbug! Yes, it's exactly so. I'm a humbug.
Oh.
The extraterrestrial craft that ostensibly crash-landed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, it scared the establishment. You could say it spooked the spooks. And if you look at the first week or two of local reporting on that incident, they're openly discussing the materials, the crashed craft, the bodies that were recovered, and they were kind of just open and frank about it.
So when we look back on Roswell and on that moment when a newspaper actually was able to report some version of the truth, some notion of there being an extraterrestrial craft, and how quickly that was cleaned up, there's really a lot of interesting and important information we can gather from this, because it shows a clear snapshot in history when there was not total infiltration and control over America's media. Specifically, we're looking at a pre-internet era, right? So this was a time when it would have been easier to control comparatively, but when these deep state operations weren't quite that far enough along.
When you look back at cases like Roswell and many other cases, you can see where there's a possibility of an organic event that happens. The local news media start reporting on it. Witnesses start telling their stories. The newspapers start picking it up because back in those days, at least, I think a lot of journalists were still looking for the most sensational headline. But then very quickly, we see the narrative change. And the narrative changes almost overnight. The previous stories are instantly suppressed. The witnesses that would have come forward to share an organic experience are no longer being discussed in the media and are in fact now ridiculed. And all of a sudden, the public, which was starting to go down a track of maybe believing that this event happened and there was something to it, even though we don't know what it was that maybe crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, or if you think of any other example that we could get into, it doesn't really matter, because no matter what it was big enough that somebody somewhere picked up the red phone and said, we need to change the narrative.
This scared the establishment because the explosion of media attention began to quickly change public perception about our theoretical solitude in the universe as a sentient life. They realized very quickly, whoa, we have to control the narrative. Why? Because if you craft the narrative, then you craft possibility. And if you're in control of what's possible, you're in control of what's probable.
So how do you change the narrative? If you don't have control within the media, and you don't have people on the payroll, or you don't have any mechanism of controlling all of these journalists that would just go out and start doing their job and try to win the next, prize for the top journalist, then you're not really going to be effective in changing the narrative. So to me, that suggests that when you see these accounts in history, like Oklahoma City bombing, Waco, Texas, Roswell, 9/11, coronavirus, SARS, the outbreak of SARS, the presidential elections, on and on we could go. There are many, many instances where we see an original story come out that appears to be organic, and then all of a sudden the narrative changes. And there's many examples that you can look into to see this happen in real time. And those are what end up being the conspiracy theories of the modern day, which turn into these they're treated like campfire myths, or these stories that people just make up because they're bored. And while there is a lot of bogus information that gets out there, the reason so much bogus information runs wild is because of the fact that people saw the smoke, they saw that there was something there that happened, but then all of a sudden we were told, nope, there was no smoke, so therefore there was no fire. There's nothing to it. Don't talk about it. And so then it moves into the world of censorship and suppression of anybody that wants to look into these things. Think of the JFK assassination, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, even the start of World War II, Pearl Harbor, the sinking of the Titanic. Many examples of where the narrative was suddenly changed, and instead of having open forums, which you would expect in a free society with a free press, where you would have, different debates and discussions, you would have journalists printing news headlines that showed different theories about what happened. We don't see that. We see only one story told.
You have to realize that these corporations do own things, and of course the CIA is very much in it because they profit from this as well. Mm-hmm. And I hearken back to Bill Casey, who was director when I was still on active duty there, so at the CIA. First thing he said at the first staff meeting at the White House, and I know this because my friend was there, Barbara Honegger is her name, he said, when we succeed in getting the entire American people to believe what we tell them to believe, we will have succeeded in our objective. So this packaging of the truth it was started and got on steroids then. Now it's off the charts.
First, looking at a controlled narrative perspective, we might consider that the event was a mishandling of propaganda, that they initially attempted at first to blame it on swamp gas or weather balloon, and then somehow the story got out of their hands. However, let's entertain the possibility that maybe that was actually their intended goal. Is it really possible to keep the idea of UFOs secret when they're being seen all around the skies? Because at this time in history, we had the Trinity explosions that happened also very near this time, and that saw an incredible explosion of UFO sightings. So from a logistical perspective, from a strategy perspective, is it really possible to create an excuse in the form of swamp gas or weather balloons that could explain all these events when you had thousands of people having their own personal sightings? I don't think it was. I think potentially a better explanation is that they wanted to allow the public to believe that there was actually a secret organization within the military, within the government, that did know about extraterrestrials and was trying to cover it up. And what that would do is it would create a cul-de-sac before the gold mine, or a controlled opposition within this reality management hierarchy that they themselves could control.
The narrative that's created is the story that those in power want us to know. But it's not necessarily the truth. In fact, the more you look into the facts of many of these cases, you'll see that it is the opposite of the truth. There might be elements of truth mixed in, but when you really look at the entire story, you'll realize that we've been lied to for decades and decades, if not centuries. You can trace this all the way back.
It's funny, it harkens back to Roswell in a way, because if you look at the leak that came out with the newspaper in the Roswell event, where one newspaper was able to really share the truth, it's almost like that's an example of panic for them. That's an example of something they knew they had to seal up, that they understood that their control had to be more total. So then when you look years later at the creation and the implementation of Operation Mockingbird, then you really have the kind of deep control that they were seeking to manifest.
And I would argue that there's many people and persons throughout history who do have ties to the Central Intelligence Organization and other arms of this deep state apparatus that were definitely plants that were trying to manipulate and adjust the UFO and ufology study for their own purposes.
It's interesting to note that now there are a lot of controlled narratives coming out. You have groups like To the Stars coming out with very controlled disclosure narratives, and you have a lot of the experts, so-called experts and former military people coming forward in groups like this, and they're still trying to point things back to Roswell. And you have a lot of push to try to bring the discussion back to Roswell. And I find this to be kind of ridiculous, because since then, that was sort of like the birth of ufology, because there was one crack in the facade. You really had a lot of people latch onto that, and you had a culture that was birthed from that leak of information. And so we have now decades, 70 years of research into ufology. We have years and years of testimony and documentation and forensic evidence that has come out. And yet you see a lot of the controlled deep state narratives trying to bring it back to Roswell, because it's now become this sort of iconic, very curated event. So it's almost like when that happened, when they lost control of the narrative in that one moment, they took advantage of it becoming this sort of kitschy time in American history, and they used that to their advantage for all these years.
So now why do you think that these kinds of programs have been so highly funded and are so widespread? Wouldn't they want people to really believe that aliens are around the next corner and going to come and help us all, and in some marvelous extravaganza, Star Trek-like extravaganza, And so just think about through the 80s, through the 90s, with your Babylon 5s and your remakes of Star Trek and all, and they're preposterously bad. Could those not be part of this great media agenda? Then you had the X-Files, right? Why is it that human impotency peaked exactly as these kinds of shows and others were the most watched shows? Well, it's working on a psychic, archetype of, when we're in trouble, because we're infantile, we're not fixing our own problems, we'll have the man in the white hat. So that's why I had to sort of not abandon it, but take a different tack, move into other areas. And again, just on the most basic level, my book is, coming at the whole thing from a completely different perspective than most of the other, if not all of the other. I think there's a few exceptions, but basically, in general, I take a completely different tack than most of the people who talk about alien intervention.
But now you have people who are much more informed. You have a ufology community that has been digging and digging and digging the whole time, so that when they come out with information and they try to relate it back to Roswell, my answer is, why are you trying to take ufology back 50, 60 years? We already answered those questions. We already know what was going on. We already sorted that out. We don't need disclosure of Roswell. We want disclosure of all the current information that's going on. So when I see them trying to take it back to that era, I think it shows weakness, and it shows kind of their original weakness and their failure to deal with that event properly. And now we have a great advantage because we have such a strong community of researchers. And it's not that the community hasn't been infiltrated, and of course there's disinformation that's been seeded all throughout ufology, but in terms of a case that you would bring into a court of law, we have enough evidence to put together things that would be considered proof. So I think we have a great advantage with ufology right now to really push things further, but we have to watch out for attempts to take it back to Roswell and take the information back into this old school mentality as a form of control.
To combat the lies of the state, to combat the lies of the mainstream media and those who are giving us the narratives of our society today, there's been the rise of what's called the alternative media. And there's always been these people throughout history who've risen up and said, hey, I'm going to tell you the truth, even though this is what the church is telling you, what the king is telling you, what the president's telling you, what the media is telling you. I'm going to come up and I'm going to tell you the truth. In history, they used to burn those people at the stake and make examples out of them. But in the modern day, what they do with many of these alternative journalists, who are many of them are just journalists who left the mainstream because they saw how fallacious it was and how corrupt it was. Many of them are now burned at the stake in terms of being censored online. Their reporting is hard to find. Many of them are completely just taken down overnight. So the more that alternative media has grown and has actually had an effect on waking people up to a new way of looking at things, we see the reaction coming from the mainstream that desperately wants to control the narrative.
I believe the future is a golden era. I think we have some economic problems and social issues to work through, but I'm very optimistic. I think President Trump has delivered in most of the ways he's promised and continues to do so. And as far as the corruption and evil that exists and has basically been running society, I believe there is an army of truth warriors, digital soldiers out there exposing them. We call it the Great Awakening. And it started by QAnon. And basically that is a movement about researching corruption and exposing it. And it has started an army of citizen journalists, and that has given us a second chance, a fighting chance, and we're starting to win.
We have really won a lot of ground in the social media sense, of individual mavericks studying. These books are available. This new thought is really what it is. It's a sort of a new way of looking at things. We're astrologically moving from the age of Pisces, and that's good because that represented deception and deceptions within deception. And you see, what's really happening in terms of the future is a great catharsis is taking place, right? And that catharsis is both psychic, but it's also social. And it is a good thing. It may look destructive on the surface, but it's really deconstructive ultimately, and it's happened numerous times. It can look to people who have been drugged by affluenza, right? That when the earthquake comes, it can feel like it's, doomsday, right? Yeah, because you've lived in a bubble of affluenza all your life. And you're not able, you've forgotten how change feels. And just because a bunch of nitwits are running around burning things, hey, we built it and we'll build it again. We can build it 10 times over. Right? Even if half of America's cities fall, we'll build it again. We built it for the first time. And this time we'll build it with a will that's very akin to our forebears, you see. So there's great hope because of the internet and the websites and all of that. Some have come down. Yeah, that emboldens you to go and open up again.
Ultimately, I'm very optimistic for the future. I'm hopeful because I think that the citizen journalist uprising, whereby in real time you have millions of people reporting on events as they're happening, right? Because we all have cell phones, we all have cameras on us, and the central control over events is becoming increasingly difficult. So they're now just deplatforming people who are challenging their centralized, standardized, pre-approved opinion. And they're, shadow banning accounts. Or if you mention certain things, you get put in the penalty box. They don't allow certain things to organically trend. So they're putting their finger on the scale. And they do that because they're scared. They understand that legacy media is losing its grip. The average age of someone who's watching cable news is 65 and older now. And so they've understood that, and they've understood, well, we need to reach the youth through different means. We need to use Facebook and social media. We need to use TikTok, which is now banned, to basically capture the minds or the hearts and minds of the youth. But ultimately, they're losing their grip. And you have millions of people who are rising up and taking on the noble age-old challenge of the transmission of information.
And that's why you're seeing all of the panic at the deep state level. You're seeing all of the panic from fake news attacking QAnon as a movement constantly. And not just the Q movement. Citizen journalists everywhere, whether they follow Q or not, are starting to take back the narrative. And that's what's really, I think, giving us the chance to win.
I think the reason we're seeing more suppression is because we are becoming more successful at pushing the narrative that free speech is important no matter what. We don't have to agree, but human beings should have the opportunity to look at things in different ways. We should be able to look at multiple theories about different events that have happened, whether they be in modern times or in history. We should be able to listen to multiple and diverse journalists and platforms and artists. We shouldn't be cordoned off into looking at things in this very narrow and singular way. So I have a lot of hope because I see a massive movement of resistance. And instead of fighting it head on, what I see a lot of things happening in the alternative media is that there's a lot of people that are just trying to create something better. And I think that's the solution. You go with the Buckminster Fuller solution, which is you don't destroy something and create something new. You create something better within the decaying structure or the corrupt structure. And that better element will grow up, become strong, and the older system will fall away of its own accord.
I believe that there is great cause for optimism. And I believe this fundamentally for two reasons. Reason number one, there is a striving for the truth that does exist inside of most human beings. And in fact, if that weren't true, then I don't believe that we would be capable of surviving in the first place. We must make sense out of things. Reason number two is that the values that we adopt at a deep level inside of ourselves come primarily from the people in our lives and only secondarily from propagandists and their newspapers and their TV shows and their music, if you can call it that. So for these reasons, I believe there's a great cause for optimism.
So that's my hope in the future, I believe in humanity, even though sometimes it's not easy to do. I believe in the fact that people desire freedom. They don't want to have all of their stories cherry-picked for them and their information cherry-picked for them. And there is a new awakening that is happening right now. And I think that those that are trying to control the narrative and keep control over information and therefore the human mind are in for a rude awakening. That's not the direction that humanity wants to go. And I personally am just honored to be a part of that, of putting content out there that helps people think outside the box and look at themselves and the world in a different way, and that they can come to their own conclusions about what the truth is and what the truth isn't.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. Okay, I don't know. Whatever it is, it's not right on the teleprompter. I don't know what that is. I've never seen that.
No, there is. We are going to do Sting, yeah.
Okay, but now I can't read it. There's no words on it.
Okay. Right? Sure.
There's no words there. To play us out. What does that mean? To play us out.
Sting is going to do. It's a video. Sting video.
What is?
For credits.
I don't know what that means. To play us out. What does that mean? To end the show?
Yeah.
All right, go.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. And we will leave you with a. I can't do it. We'll do it live.
Okay.
We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it, and we'll do it live. Fucking thing sucks.
In 5, 4, 3.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks again for watching. We'll leave you with Sting and a cut off his new album. Take it away.